It's another canning video, and today on Great Lakes Country, we're whipping up a great big batch of homemade apple pie filling and canning it all up. Starting with a ton of fresh apples, we'll go through each step to prepare the apples and make our little sugary, syrupy apple pie concoction. And of course, can it all up, and then what kind of video would this be if I didn't then use a jar of it to make an apple pie? So let's do it. The first thing I need to do is get my apples peeled and sliced. So I'll use my handy crank handle apple peeling machine and make quick work of removing those skins. I'll just do a couple apples at a time so they don't have a chance to turn brown as I go. I'll cut the peeled apples in eighths, then scoop and slice out the core area from each one. And finally, slice each of those segments in half so I end up with apple slices that are about this thick. And while I'm doing that, I'll mention I'm starting off with about 9 to 10 pounds of apples. This is enough to get somewhere between 4 and 5 quarts of apple pie filling. As far as the apple variety I'm using, my usual go-to for apple pie filling used to be Honeycrisp, but in the last couple years I've become a huge fan of a variety called Cosmic Crisp. I'm not sure if Cosmic Crisp apples are everywhere or if it's more of a local thing. In any case, it's a very good apple for eating plain or making things out of. They're pretty sweet and not tart, which works perfectly with this canning recipe since we have to add some tart flavor later on in the form of lemon juice. Anyway, as I go, I'll drop my cut up slices into a pot of cold water that has about 1/4 of a cup of lemon juice squirted in it. This lightly lemony water will prevent these slices from turning brown during the little while that it's going to take me to peel and cut up all the rest of the apples. Now I've got a big old pot of my cut up apple slices and we're moving over to the stove. At this point, I need to blanch these apples. That is, drop them in some boiling water for 1 minute and then pull them right back out. I'll do this in a few batches as to not overcrowd the pot and bring the water temperature down too much. And unlike most things I blanch, I will not be plunging these apple slices into ice water after the boiling step. I'll just put them into a different pot that has no water in it and put a lid on there to keep the apples from cooling too much. In the meantime, I've got my jars heating up in the water bath canner. This will probably be a long enough water bath that the jar boiling step isn't entirely necessary, but it's a force of habit at this point, and I need to heat the jars up anyway for when we start filling them. Now to make the sauce component, I'm not quite sure what the liquidy gel-like part of apple pie filling is called, so I'll go with sauce. Anyway, we'll start by adding 2 3/4 cups of white sugar to a stock pot, followed by 3/4 of a cup of this stuff called ClearJel cooking starch, which I bought online. I'll put a link to this stuff in the description below in case you also can't find it at your grocery store. Next, a teaspoon of ground cinnamon, a 1/2 teaspoon of ground nutmeg, and a 1/2 teaspoon of ground allspice. Lastly, 2 1/2 cups of no sugar added apple juice and 1 1/4 cups water. Now I'm turning on the heat to about medium high, and I'll stir this mixture pretty much constantly until it all comes to a low boil, at which time I'm adding a 1/2 cup of lemon juice and cooking for 1 more minute, stirring constantly. This mixture is quite thick at this point from that ClearJel, and I definitely don't want to let it scorch on the bottom of the pot. Okay, now the heat is turned off and it's time to fold in all those apple slices. I'll thoroughly mix them all in there until the sauce is completely coating those apples. Now we're moving back over to the counter because it's time to start filling the jars. I'll carefully drain the canner water out of each quart jar and set them on a folded towel on the counter. And using my canning funnel, I'll just start ladling in that apple pie filling mixture. I'll load up the jars until the filling is about 1 inch from the top, and I'll fine tune this a little more in a couple minutes. Once my jars are all nearly full, I'm going to do the debubbling step. Normally I debubble after checking the headspace, but this debubbling step is also going to help that chunky mixture settle a bit more, thereby bringing down the overall level of the filling in those jars. So after the debubbling step, I'll add a little bit more filling to each jar and then check each one to ensure I've got that 1 inch headspace in each jar. Okay, the headspace is looking good, so now it's time to wipe the rims. Using a damp paper towel, or rather a couple paper towels, since this mixture is quite thick and sticky, I'll thoroughly clean the top edge of each jar. If any of this sticky sauce or its residue remains on a jar rim, it it will inhibit a proper seal between the glass and the lid's rubber gasket and can lead to a failed seal. Finally, I'll set the lids in place and then screw on the metal rings. No need to crank them down with all my strength, just finger tight. Now it's time to process these jars in the canner, so let's move back over to the stove. And an extra step I've been doing for the last couple years is to check the temperature of my canner water and compare it to the temperature of my jars. This water is quite hot from having simmered those jars, and the jars are quite hot from having been in that water, not to mention having piping hot apple pie filling put in them. But I want to make sure the temperatures are pretty close together. So using my infrared thermometer, I can see that the canner water is about 137 degrees and my jars are about 128 degrees. That's pretty close, so I feel quite comfortable setting those jars in there. I do this step to make sure that the temp difference isn't too big because cold water and hot glass, or hot water and cold glass, are going to increase the chances of a broken jar by a lot. I used to get the occasional broken jar from time to time, but since I've started checking the temps first, I've not had a single jar break in the canner. And if the temps were too far apart, maybe more than about 20 degrees, I'd just heat that canner water up a little more, or cool it down a bit by adding some cold water to it. Anyway, we're looking good, and I've got all my jars set into the canner, taking care not to let them touch one another or the side walls of the canner. And my water level is about an inch above the level of the jars, which is what I want. So now I'm turning the stove on to high and letting this whole canner come up to a full boil. When the canner reaches a full boil, I'll go ahead and start my timer for 25 minutes. The processing time for this recipe is 25 minutes for either quarts or pints. Okay, processing is complete, and I'm taking out the jars and setting them back on a towel on the counter. Now I just have to leave these alone for the next several hours while they cool. And over the next little while, I'll expect to hear the lids pop on each one, signaling a sealed lid and a successful canning. And as always, if any of the lids don't pop, I could try reprocessing that one, but usually I'll just stick that particular jar in the fridge and make sure to use it first. Failed seals don't happen often, but they happen sometimes, and they happen to everyone. And that's it. Delicious, homemade, home-canned apple pie filling. But what kind of video would this be if I didn't jump ahead in time and actually use one of my jars of pie filling to actually make an apple pie? So I'll whip up a quick pie crust with the help of my food processor. I'll start by combining 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 1 teaspoon of sugar. I'll give that a couple pulses just to mix it all together, and then I'm taking out the regular food processor blade and putting on my grating disc. Because I next need to add 2 sticks of butter to the dry mixture, and grating it with the food processor is way quicker than cutting it up into tiny cubes with a knife. Now I'll put the regular blade back in and pulse it all up until the butter bits are completely incorporated in. Lastly, I'll add 1/3 of a cup of ice water and pulse a few more times until my mixture comes together into a rough dough. Out onto a floured surface it goes, and I'll gently squish it all together until I have a single lump of dough. Then I'll cut it in half, form each piece into somewhat of a ball, and then wrap each of them separately in some plastic wrap. Now the dough balls need to go in the fridge for at least 1 hour. After which, I'll let the dough warm back up on the counter for just a little while before rolling it out on a floured surface. And I've said it a million times, but I am not especially talented at rolling out, shaping, or otherwise manipulating dough. So I'll just do the best I can to get that thing in place over my pie pan and trim around the edges. Next, I'll bring back the pie filling and start loading up that pie. Because of these enormously deep pie pans that I have, I ended up needing more than a quart of filling for a single pie. I added about an additional half quart to fill this thing out. Now roll out the other half of the dough, get it in place, pinch it together with the lower pie crust around the lip of the pan, trim around the edge. Lastly, I'll brush the top with a simple egg wash, sprinkle on some coarse raw sugar, and cut 4 small slits in the top so the pie can vent. I'll bake this pie at 375 degrees for about 40 minutes or until the top is golden brown. And there we have it. Not the best pie crust job I've ever seen, but all in all, that pie is looking pretty nice to me. I'll let it mostly cool before slicing it up and giving it a taste. A delicious apple pie made from delicious apple pie filling. What's not to like about that? Be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future canning videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Great Lakes Country. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.